Welcome back to the Indiana Jones in History podcast. I'm your host, Justin Jacobs. Last episode, we answered the question, who confronted Indiana Jones? Today, we are going to deal with what is by far the most important question of all, one that I, and perhaps you, have been eagerly awaiting the answer to our entire lives, namely, did Hollywood get it right? Okay, we're going to talk about whether or not there is anything in the films that is reflective of the actual history of Western archaeological expeditions in the non-Western world that we have examined in the first 4 episodes of this podcast series. Okay? Now, one of our sources that we're going to be using here, in addition to the films themselves, we're going to do a close reading of the things that happen in the films themselves, but we are also going to have the added benefit of insights into a 1978 brainstorming session that took place over a period of, I believe, 5 days in Los Angeles, chiefly between George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Larry Kasdan, who will eventually have co-writing credits on the screenplay. Okay, now this is a private conversation that took place in someone's private residence, but they recorded the conversation. They made tapes, and these tapes were preserved, and then they were transcribed. Someone else listened to the tapes, and they typed out 125 pages of transcribed text of these conversations that took place among these men in Los Angeles. And they also then added a further appendix of another conversation in which co-writer Phil Kaufman and researcher Deborah Fine were also included in here. Okay, so eventually there's actually 5 voices during the original creative brainstorms for the very first film that was going to appear 3 years later, Raiders of the Lost Ark, in 1981. All right, now, I am inclined, usually, I recognize, let's be honest with ourselves, this is a private conversation, this is a bunch of guys shooting the breeze in the privacy of their home, okay? So I don't necessarily want to go into this conversation and rip it to shreds, like the literary theorist and literary critic inside of me, the old English major inside of me so badly wants to do. Nonetheless, they made tapes, they made a transcription, they kept it in storage, and then it's clear that when the films came out, if you go back and read this brainstorm, it's clear that the films themselves reproduce much of the ideas that were bandied about during this brainstorming session. So there is a connection between creative shooting the breeze in a private residence and the actual films that got out on the silver screen. As we'll see, I'll point out the connections between the two. When there is zero connection whatsoever, and they just say something totally offensive and ridiculous, and yet it never made it into the films, well, then I don't really think that's fair game. That's just being mean. All right? If we all have our private conversations recorded, and every single thing we say, but never act upon in the real world, can be held up for criticism, then God help us all. But nonetheless, they saved these tapes, and then in 2008, the transcript was leaked to the internet at the exact same time that a retrospective sort of a book covering the first 3 films in preparation for the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, the 4th film, when it came out in 2008, they published a book in which Lucas and Spielberg gave a brand new foreword to the book. They were on board, they knew what was in it, and there were actual facsimiles of several pages from the brainstorming session. All right, this transcribed text. So clearly it's not authorized entirely for the whole thing to be available, and the excerpts that they included in that 2008 book were not the worst ones. They're ones that make them look okay. Okay, but it's legit. It's authentic. This is not some, internet hoax or a prank. Okay, and it's been received as a legitimate thing. And there's been no indication from anyone who is mentioned in this transcript that it's some sort of a fake. So this is real. Okay, and I'm sorry, if you do create something that is watched by billions of people and becomes a cultural phenomenon and is bouncing around in all of our minds as we grow up, then we're allowed to critique it. We're allowed to analyze it, especially if there's connections between the brainstorming session and what appears on the actual screen, which there is, as we'll see. Let's begin with the origins of the film, the broad concepts and where the film came from, and the character concepts. Okay, now in this conversation, this brainstorming session, it's mostly Lucas talking. If I had to guess, I'd say 80% of all the words that are spoken and written down are from George Lucas. All right, he's the guy with the majority of the ideas. Spielberg talks probably second most, but when he does talk, many of his ideas, actually, you find out they're very influential, and they get put into the final product as well. But it is mostly Lucas talking. And he opens up, all right, talking about where his ideas came from. And he tells Spielberg and Kasdan his ideas for what he calls, quote, an archaeological exorcist who is an expert in the occult. Well, this should be your first indication of how much historical input is actually going to go into the films. All right? Not surprisingly, after you hear that the first idea for Indiana Jones is that of an archaeological exorcist who is an expert in the occult, not once in 125 pages of transcribed conversation is there mention of a single name of a real-life archaeologist or explorer. Not one! Since, in case you didn't know already, there is no such thing as an archaeological exorcist. Okay? So, if they didn't look to history for anything, which is fine, it's fine, they're entertainers. They need to sell tickets. I get it. I'm not some, horrible literary critic here who's going to rake him over the coals for every last little thing. A totally, historically accurate film might be pretty boring. I admit that. Okay, so where do the ideas come from then? Pretty much 100% previous Hollywood productions. Okay, there was almost no history involved whatsoever in the formulation of these films. That was a surprise to me. Maybe it wasn't to you, maybe I'm just naive, but I grew up thinking that there was a lot of historical input into this. We'll talk more about that in a minute. All right, Lucas admits in the very beginning of the brainstorming session that it should be done, quote, like the Republic serials, as a 30s serial, which is where a lot of the stuff comes from anyways. What does he mean when he talks about Republic serials? He's referring to Republic Pictures Film Studio, which was active from the 1930s to the 1950s and specialized in short, serialized westerns, detective stories, horror flicks, with a cliffhanger every 15 to 20 minutes to make sure the audience came back next week and bought another ticket. Okay? And you can see when, in the film, that's clearly how Lucas wants to do this. Every 15 to 20 minutes, there's a new cliffhanger, and the hero has to extricate himself from a life or death situation, and it's very exciting. It's go, 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 go. You can't breathe in an Indiana Jones film. That's the whole point. There is other non-historical cultural input as well. The character of Indiana Jones, when they're thinking about prototypes for him, they refer to other actors and the characters that these actors have played. And they talk about John Wayne, Clark Gable, Sean Connery, Clint Eastwood, and some of the heroes that are invoked as a template. They want to merge these people together. James Bond, Sherlock Holmes, Clark Kent are all mentioned as elements of these people should be involved in Indiana Jones. Previous films and books are also given their due attention. Mention is made of the Maltese Falcon, The Land of the Pharaohs, Casablanca, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, King Kong, 3 Days of the Condor, and the book Lord of the Rings. Even theme parks are invoked. At one point, both Lucas and Spielberg say it should be like one of those scary rides at Disneyland. Or like going into Ripley's Believe It or Not. Okay? So, what is the extent then of filmmaker research? Is there any research whatsoever regarding history that actually goes into this? We know they did a lot of research regarding historical period details. At one point, Lucas and Spielberg are discussing whether or not they had life rafts in the 1930s. Because if Indiana Jones is going to jump out of a plane and try to use, a life raft to fall down into the river, that has to be historically accurate. They're very concerned about the accuracy of certain props and period details. But as far as the actual political, economic, cultural history and whatnot, you notice really fast when you're going through this brainstorming session that there's almost nothing. And yet this comes as a surprise to many people. Like I said, myself, I grew up thinking that of all the adventure films that involve these themes to one degree or another, Indiana Jones has to be the one that has the most historical affiliations or associations somehow. Again, maybe I'm just so totally naive and you guys are so much more savvy and you never thought that. I did. So this was kind of a shock to me. Okay. Now, despite the prevalence of recycled Hollywood material for the bulk of the ideas in Raiders of the Lost Ark, the films seem to have historical pretensions. Okay? I was seduced into thinking that they contain some bona fide history. Unlike, let's say, The Mummy. Okay, The Mummy was a film. Brendan Fraser, those films, and there were several sequels. I went and saw The Mummy when it came out. What was it, 1998, 99? And not for a moment before, during, or after did I ever think, oh yeah, this has some history in it. No, it was just a romp around the yard. Total fiction, and I accepted that. I didn't think that way with Indiana Jones. Why? I think there's two reasons. One, the Nazis make for great period villains, and they conjure up historical credibility. We all know the Nazis existed, okay? And if we're not history majors, our extent of what happened before we were born is very limited for most of us. All right, but the Nazis are historically verified people, villains usually, that everyone knows existed, and we actually feel like we know something about them, some of the details, the horrible things that they did, some of their racial ideologies, the Holocaust, the wars, Blitzkrieg. We all have words that, and themes and ideas that we associate with the Nazis. It's one of the rare sources of real historical knowledge that we actually are exposed to informally outside of school. And so we kind of think, oh, if we see Nazis, that's a historical thing. They're great period villains in that sense. We see Nazis and we think, oh, there must be some history behind this. I don't know what it is, but I actually know something about Nazis. And then second, the films do actually regurgitate prominent themes from the history of archaeology that we've talked about. Sometimes they're real accurate things, either intentionally or unintentionally put in. Other times they are a subconscious reflection or regurgitation of Orientalist stereotypes and ugly racist invective that we saw the archaeologists themselves speak on several occasions. Remember last episode, James Henry Breasted? I felt dirty even uttering some of his words. They're so horrible. Some of that stuff does come out, not so blatantly in the film, but we will see it. Let's begin with the basic plot premise of the first film. The Nazi obsession with the occult, and more specifically, the Ark of the Covenant. Where do they get this from? Here we're going to see the filmmakers making the same mistake. Well, mistake from a historian's point of view. From their point of view, no mistakes were made in these films at all. They were fabulously successful. Right? They're going to make, from a historical point of view, however, if you're a stickler for this, the same mistake they're going to make with the third film, and to a certain extent on the fourth film as well, with the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and the alien contact and whatnot. They're going to rely on fringe sensationalist conspiracy theories to attribute ahistorical, that means non-historical, didn't actually happen at this time, ahistorical motives to historical characters like the Nazis. Okay? Because the filmmakers clearly did next to no historical research, or at least nothing that a professional historian would recognize as research, and did not consult a single professional historian in the formulation of these films. The sources they use are what a real practicing professional historian, not me of course, I would never say this, what a real historian, however, might politely refer to as wacko conspiracy theories peddled by profit-hungry showmen. I did not say that. Here's a quote from Lucas from the Brainstorm talking about the textual inspiration for his ideas. It says, quote, "We have some research on how Adolf Hitler, in 1936 or whatever, was a fanatic for this kind of stuff, occult craziness. We have another book where he was looking for the spear that killed Jesus, which was in a museum in Czechoslovakia. Well, he was a fanatic for finding this sort of occult stuff." All right, so Lucas makes allusions to two books, specific books. Well, we can track these down. So what are his sources for these claims? It's easy to track these things down. They actually mentioned in passing. One of them is mentioned by name, and the other one you can usually piece together and figure out what he's talking about. The first one is Erich von Daniken, a book he wrote in 1968 called Chariot of the Gods, Unsolved Mysteries of the Past. The second book was 5 years later, 1973, 5 years before the brainstorming session. Both of these are within the decade prior to the brainstorming session. Trevor Ravenscroft, 1973, The Spear of Destiny. The occult power behind the spear which pierced the side of Christ. Wow, what a pair of titles. Now, the major ideas from these books. Erich von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods. He promotes the idea that most civilizations were inspired by human contact with extraterrestrial life forms. Okay? This is an idea where when it's used in the fourth film to show how the ancient civilization and the monuments they built down in the jungles of Latin America, South America, they're trying to understand where did the natives come up with the idea, or the talent and the know-how and the means to build these magnificent cities and ruins and monuments. The answer ends up being revealed in the title of the film, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. They didn't build it themselves. Aliens came down at one point in the distant past and taught the natives, the scantily clad, dark-skinned natives, how to build their monuments. Okay? They got that directly from Erich von Daniken. Now, many scholars look at things like this, these ideas, not this specifically. I don't know of anyone who's actually analyzed this in this way. But the idea that native indigenous peoples throughout the world, non-Westerners, that they couldn't have built the grand monuments in their midst was a very popular idea in the history of Western archaeological expeditions. In many places, they would go throughout the world and they'd say, here we are. Let's say the Mayans, for instance. This was often a very common discourse among the Mayans. The Europeans showed up in Central America, saw these grand monumental Mayan pyramids and ruins, and they looked around and said, who could have built these things? Well, these ignorant savages who actually live here now and are wearing loincloths and are dark skinned, no way it was them. You kidding me? They couldn't have done this. And they tried to imagine, how could this have been done? And every single explanation that they had, nearly every single explanation, was some sort of external stimulus that had nothing to do with the natives. They said that maybe it was a lost tribe of Israel that came over to the New World, something taken up by the Mormons when they posited the idea that Christianity had come over to the New World and was rediscovered by Joseph Smith in the 1830s. All right. They would say perhaps it was Greek refugees from the lost island of Atlantis who came over here and built them. Okay, really absurd stuff. Absurd to our ears today. 200 years ago, we could give them a little bit of, we can give them some room to hang themselves with, all right? I mean, that was 200 years ago, and they didn't know a whole lot. But 1970s? It's kind of... 1970s, Eric von Daniken, 1968. 2008? Putting that as the main plot device in your film? Come on. That's kind of insulting, don't you think? The natives weren't capable of building this. They had to have contact with aliens. Ay. All right, so the other idea that they get from Daniken, he says that the Hebrew Ark, the Ark of the Covenant, was a form of radio communication with God. They even have that line in the Brainstorm, in the final film. At one point, they say it's a way of communicating with God, a radio line to God. Okay, all right, so that's von Daniken. Trevor Ravenscroft in The Spear of Destiny, he claims to be able to communicate with a dead Nazi author who leaves a memoir in the 1950s. I'm not kidding you. I'm not making this shit up. This is really what it is. And he tells a dubious tale of Hitler's fascination with the occult power of various Judeo-Christian artifacts. Let's not mince words and be polite and sell ourselves short. Both books are utter nonsense. All right, fringe conspiracy theorists who peddle sensational tales that every respectable historian who does real research in the world disavows and says this is fiction, not history. Doesn't matter. No one cares what a university professor says. They sell millions of books and become famous, and then that creates their own self-perpetuating interest in continuing to publish such ridiculous stuff because people will buy it. Von Daniken became, unimaginably wealthy. Tens of millions of copies of his books sold. There were TV specials on it and whatnot. I originally come from the field of modern Chinese history, and in the field of Chinese history, we have the same problem with the expeditions of Zheng He, 7 maritime expeditions of Zheng He from 1405 to 1403. You have these magnificent maritime expeditions by a eunuch of the Ming Dynasty who eventually goes to Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and then even goes to the east coast of Africa. That's all he did, okay? Every respectable, serious historian in the world says that's what he did. That's as far as he got. And then 15 years ago or so, this retired British sailor, Gavin Menzies, comes along and writes 2 books. I can't remember the exact title of each one, but one of them is something like 1405, the year that the Chinese discovered America. And then when that sold 1 billion copies and made him a rich man, he wrote another one, 1433 or whatever it is, one of the other expeditions of Zheng He, how the Chinese sailed to Italy and ignited the Renaissance. Give me a break. There has actually been a petition by professional Chinese historians who have actually written the publisher of that book and told them, you have to reclassify this as fiction. You cannot sell this as history because not a serious single historian recognizes this as history. There is not a shred of respectable evidence anywhere in this book. That's how serious the historians take it when they realize that such nonsense is being peddled to the general public as real history. That is exactly what we're seeing with Eric von Daniken and Trevor Ravenscroft in these 2 books. And unfortunately, they serve, oh my God, as the bulk of the basis. And this is what Lucas is talking about when he says our research, our historical research. He's talking about von Daniken and Ravenscroft, for God's sake. Now, despite this dubious history to begin with, history in quotation marks, The connection with actual history is made even more tenuous by hints in the Brainstorm that Lucas might not even have actually read these books. He may have just skimmed their book jackets. At one point he says, quote, "We'll just say that Hitler has been trying to find this spear, which is history." No, it's not. And that he's also trying to find this ark. You could have gotten that from the titles and the back book jacket, okay? He doesn't seem to know much more than that, or have actually read through the book, because later on in the Brainstorm, you actually see a point in which Lucas confuses the author, Eric von Daniken, with the name of a potential lead character. I don't know if this is conscious or not, or unconscious, or what, or if he's playing word games, but listen to this. At one point, they're trying to describe Indiana Jones being convinced to take up a mission, and he says, quote, "In the end, they convince him to do it because they say this Professor Eric von Daniken, or whatever, this German version of himself, is the one who found it." He's actually, this has to be unconscious. He doesn't even realize that Eric von Daniken is the author of the book from which he's taking these ideas about the Ark being a form of radio communication with God. All right, and the spear from Trevor Ravenscroft's book. Eric von Daniken is an actual character in the Brainstorm, not just the author of the book. That's how close the connection is. Eventually, we learn that co-writer Phil Kaufman also did a lot of research. Lucas refers to, oh, Phil has more on this, Phil has more research, he's the one who actually did some of the reading and whatnot. Okay, well then what did Phil actually dredge up? Well, we know. There is an appendix. There is an appendix to the original transcript between Lucas, Kasdan, and Spielberg, in which Kaufman talks to Larry Kasdan and Deborah Fine. Deborah Fine in the credits is credited with research, all right? So what did Kaufman use other than Daniken and Ravenscroft? Well, in this appendix, we actually see an interrogation of Kaufman by Kasdan and Fine. In this interrogation, Kaufman admits to having 5 historical sources. Again, historical, put quotation marks around that. He says, here are the sources for the ideas I've come up with. The Spear of Destiny, that's the Ravenscroft book. The Bible. A television special on the Dead Sea Scrolls. A single entry in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, that's finally some respectable stuff, right? And an article on the Ark written by my mononucleosis blood doctor 20 years earlier in the 1950s. Are you kidding me? Deborah Fine then chimes in and calls the film's premise, quote, fairly hokey, and not based upon, quote, any serious excavations or attempts by archaeologists to actually find these items. Finally, hallelujah! Someone's actually coming in and calling bullshit where they see bullshit. It's fine if you want to make this a work of fiction, but let's not have historical pretensions here, all right? One day, 40 years from now, some upstart historian of archaeology is going to be laughing at us on a podcast. And then she continues, not impressed. She says, quote, talking to Kaufman, so basically, it was your doctor and his article and von Daniken and the Bible and nothing else that we know anything about. Those are her words. I'm reading, her transcribed words verbatim. I love it. Kaufman's then response, however, is unassailable. He responds to Kaufman with the phrase that wins the box office day. He says, quote, but you want it to be fun. Yes, we do. No problem with that. These are filmmakers. They're making an entertaining product that will convince us to buy movie tickets. Okay? But wouldn't it be nice if we could still maintain all the fun drama and adventure and some superstitious stuff, exorcism and all that crap. I'm all on board for that. That's fun. That's creative. But do we really have to perpetuate new historical misunderstandings in the process? Now everyone thinks that Hitler and the Nazis were fanatics of the occult. They weren't. It helps to reinforce the idea that Nazism was a monstrous aberration, easy to write off because the Nazis were just freaks. They weren't like you and me. There's no danger of us lapsing into Nazism one day because they're not like you and me. They're a completely different breed of human. Look at all the freaky, weird stuff they did. They're a totally different kind of people. No! There's mountains of historical scholarship that shows that they're rational decisions. Logical decisions and connections that they made in their ideologies. They were rational humans who shared much, uncomfortably much in common with their rivals. You think Nazi ideas about race and Jews and the white man are just Nazis alone? Oh, you're in for a rude awakening. Read some books on ideas about ethnicity and race. throughout the entire Western world from the second half of the 19th century all the way into the 1940s and 50s, probably well beyond that. These ideas are shared across the board. I mentioned in one of the earlier episodes how all the archaeologists always engaged in anthropometry on their expeditions, measuring the heads. Not just the Nazis. Yes, the Nazis did that too when they had expeditions, and the Germans. But so did the British and the French and the Russians. Everyone did it. They assumed that there was some sort of innate genetic capacity for being able to build civilization, and some people had it and some people didn't. And when they intermixed with people, some people would retain a relic of that gift, and other people would have more or less of it, and they would measure the heads and bone structure and position of ears, chin, all this stuff to see, oh, this is an interesting ethnic relic here. We can see that 2,500 years ago, they must have mated with a Greek soldier, and that's where they have this evidence of the genius capacity for civilization in a degraded form. Nazi ideas were widespread. The Nazis are unique in just having the unique geopolitical circumstances, a dismembered Western industrial empire that had never happened before, able to strike back and put some of these ideas into practice in a hyper-intense scenario. We are all in danger of lapsing into Nazism if we aren't vigilant, because they were humans just like us. All right, let me get off my high horse. So, what did the Nazis think about the historical past? We can answer this pretty easily. It's not a difficult question, actually. Okay? It wasn't the occult. It wasn't going after the spear that pierced Christ. There is an ideological spectrum anchored by two camps. Hitler's conventional classicism versus Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, versus Heinrich Himmler's German nativism. Both men, both camps of this ideological spectrum, believed in the superiority of the Aryan race, as did most educated white men everywhere in that day and age. This is not a unique Nazi thing. Hitler and Himmler just had different views of who those Aryans were and what happened to them. For Hitler, the most impressive Aryans were subsumed into a generic veneration of Greco-Roman civilization. He said the Greeks and Romans were the most superior of all the Aryans. They created all of Western civilization, and we're now trying to claim the mantle of that Greco-Roman civilization and be the preeminent heirs to it. In this sense, Hitler's ideology towards the distant past, towards antiquity, was utterly conventional and similar in nearly every way to all Western educated elites since Napoleon. They all said the Greeks and Romans were the cream of the crop, head of the class. And they venerated them and competed with each other to collect Greek and Roman architecture and statues and blah, blah, blah. And when they started to celebrate the ancient pharaohs in Egypt as well, they celebrated it because they said these are the precursors to the Greeks. It was still all about the Greeks and the Romans. Hitler's very conventional in that sense. For Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who eventually will create a new scholarly outfit designed to do research into precisely his unique view of the history of the Aryan race, he said that the most impressive Aryans were the Nordic branch of the Aryan migration into Europe, but dilution with Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and all the usual marginalized enemies of the German state ruined it. And they stagnated and degenerated, and the German nation fell behind. So his response was to create a new scholarly outfit that would send scholars out to recover the Nordic Aryan heritage that the Germans had lost. That would be the secret to the revival of the German race, was to recover our old fabulous Nordic ancestry, that branch of the Aryans. And so Himmler financed and supported expeditions. There were actual Nazi scholarly expeditions. He sent one of his first ones out to Bohuslän in rural Sweden to transcribe rock art that he regarded to be, put down, etched into stone by the ancient Nordic race. He sent scholars to rural Finland, to a region known as Karelia, to interview Finnish witches who were imagined to retain ancient lore from the Nordic Aryan race. He sent scholars to look at and transcribe rock art in the Balkans, proving that the Romans had Nordic Aryan origins. He sent an exhibition to Tibet to try and see if he could trace the extent of Aryan migration into Asia, into East Asia. Because remember, the Nazis let the upper-class Japanese and Chinese into their little racial theory when they had to try and, explain how the Chinese and Japanese could create such a magnificent civilization clearly outside the purview of Western civilization. And they said, oh, well, that's also Aryan migration, and those are the ones who intermixed least with the subject-inferior population and created Chinese and Japanese civilization. So they sent an expedition to Tibet to do anthropometry and look into that. And of course, garner glory and fame for the German nation. Then they also had planned expeditions to Bolivia and the Canary Islands. Canary Islands, islands off of northwest Africa. It was believed that there were rumors that people had seen white-skinned people with blonde hair there. Well, these must be the Nordic Aryans who were abandoned there. Let's go find them. Another expedition to Bolivia was going to go and try to find evidence for that ridiculous theory about Nordic Aryans or Atlantis refugees or lost tribe of Israelites who may have gone to Latin America and created civilization down there. And in this case, it was going to be Nordic Aryans, perhaps, who had strayed off course during their sailing and ended up in Bolivia. Now, Hitler looked down on Himmler's agenda. The two men did not see eye to eye in their views toward antiquity. Hitler thought Himmler's agenda was embarrassing. He said, quote, "People make a tremendous fuss about the excavations carried out in districts inhabited by our forebears of the pre-Christian era. I am afraid I cannot share their enthusiasm, for I cannot help remembering that, while our ancestors were making these vessels of stone and clay, over which our archaeologists rave, the Greeks had already built an Acropolis." So whether it was Nordic Aryans or Greco-Roman Aryans, neither ideological camp in the views towards antiquity among the Nazis had much room for Jews or Christians. Now, the Nazi hostility to Jews and Judaism is well known. We don't even need to go into that, stating the obvious. But they were also quite hostile to Christianity as well. This is something that many people don't actually know about. With frequent persecutions of Christian churches and people who were seen to use Christian religion as a political front. And they had an eventual plan, vague plan, to move beyond religion in the future, once they eventually conquered the world. The German Catholic Church actually said that the Nazis, quote, "evinced a fundamental hostility to Christ and his church." Now, what are the implications for the films here? Let's get back to the films. And the implications for the films is that neither Hitler nor Himmler, or any of the Nazis, would have valorized or celebrated or admired Jewish or Christian artifacts, much less believed in their magical powers. And they certainly wouldn't have risked life and limb to obtain them. Okay, you think they're going to admit that they actually believe in the power of the Ark? That the Jews actually had a legitimate line of communication to their God? No. Or that the Christian Holy Grail actually existed and had real powers? They wouldn't have even believed that. And they certainly wouldn't have chased after it. If anything, they might have searched after these things just to destroy them for propaganda value. That's how little we think of religion and the Jews. We're going to find their Ark and then blow it up. And, record it and put it on national TV to brag about it. That's what they probably would have done. If you want to be historically accurate, and I don't know if the filmmakers want to do that, but let's just for the sake of argument, if you want to be historically accurate, the first and the third film, where you have Nazis, should not have gone after the Ark and the Grail, but rather the rock carvings of rural Sweden, or gone after witch doctors in rural Finland, if we're going on Himmler's agenda, or even if we're going to Hitler's agenda, just the Elgin marbles, or any Greco-Roman statues or monuments. That's what Hitler would have wanted to go after. Unfortunately, none of these locales have the element of Oriental exoticism that Lucas so badly wanted. And you can see in the Brainstorm he wants it bad. He and Spielberg. Quote from Spielberg, "Keep him out of the States. We don't want to do one shot in this country." He'll later amend that to having scenes at Indiana Jones's college in Washington, D.C. But still, generally speaking, keep him out of the States. We don't want to do one shot in this country. Lucas, I tried to move him around the world a little bit to see if we can't get a little Oriental influence into it just for the fun of it. Okay, well, let's ask the question then. What is Oriental influence and why is it fun? I'm not going to have a big hang up here on the use of Oriental, by the way. It's just the original Western word for the East. I know it's out of vogue now, and we'd like to replace it with Asian. It wasn't out of vogue in the 70s, all right? Let's let them use it. So what is Oriental influence, and why is it fun? Lucas. In a place like Egypt, quote, you meet all these interesting characters, and every once in a while, somebody throws a knife at him, or he beats somebody up, or somebody beats him up. Typical Middle Eastern stuff. End quote. Unfortunately. On another occasion, Lucas says that as soon as Indiana Jones, quote, gets there are knives coming out of the walls, these slimy characters are following him, all that stuff happens there in those places in the 30s. Again, if they were just shooting the shit in a brainstorm in their private home, I would never, draw attention to this. That's not fair. But the films do exactly this. He shows up in Cairo, they focus on the Oriental exoticism of it, and it's all these slimy characters throwing knives at him and trying to kill him for no reason whatsoever. And here you see it in the brainstorming session. All that stuff happens in those places in the 30s. Typical Middle Eastern stuff. Oh God, what a horrible phrase. I feel almost dirty like I was reading James Henry Breasted's quotes in episode 4. Now maybe this is the world of the 1940s Republic Pictures serials, or the 1930s comic books, or James Bond films. Maybe it's the world of that Saturday Evening Post cartoon from 1937, mocking the idea of role reversal. Only adventurous, crazy, dangerous things happen on expeditions in uncivilized countries, but certainly not in New York. But they did not happen in the actual history of archaeology, nothing even remotely like it. Let's move on and discuss the geopolitical backdrop of the films. Namely, the implausibility of the geopolitical backdrop. This is one of those things that could be easily fixed. Easily fixed. And I'll tell you how. Lucas makes clear that Cairo, in the 1930s, fits his Orientalist criteria, where it's going to be fun. A little bit of Oriental fun. It's in Cairo, he says during the brainstorm, but it doesn't have to be. I only use that because it's one of those 30s cities. No Egyptian city at any point after 1922, however, as we saw in the previous episode, was suitable for the sort of things that Lucas wants the Nazis and Indiana Jones to be able to do, even if we give them a significant amount of poetic license. Recall for a moment what happened to Howard Carter and the Earl of Carnarvon, who financed Carter's dig at the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb was discovered in late 1924. Tensions immediately erupted over who was going to be able to manage the site. They never even got to the point of trying to see if any finds were going to be divided up between the British and the Egyptians. And within less than 2 years, tensions explode. Carter can't stand the idea. He has to have his guest list vetted by Egyptian officials, and he tries to close down the tomb, lock the iron door, and not let anyone in. The Egyptians say, screw you, get out of here, and they send in the troops to cut the locks, and they take over the tomb. That's 1924. I believe it's February 1924. And even before that, 2 years before that, the Sardis affair in Turkey revealed that independent Middle Eastern countries weren't going to put up with this shit any longer. Okay? But in the first film, Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Nazis excavate outside of Cairo. They're not far from Cairo. They're like in the suburbs of Cairo. With a massive work team. With a freelance Frenchman, René Belloc, he works for the Germans, so it's still Germans are the villains, it's just this Frenchman who works with them, and German soldiers with their guns, overseeing the dig. Lucas in the brainstorm actually says, this is one of those places, Egypt, where it's just in chaos and anarchy, and so no one really knows what's going on, just take the artifact and no one's even going to know that it's been taken. That was absolutely not the case in any of these Middle Eastern countries where the expeditions could have taken place at this time period. Okay? And the fact that you have such a massive work team means that this would have been visible. That's not one or two people. Okay? And you have German soldiers with guns and tanks and planes and trucks. The suggestion seems to be here that the reason the Germans are able to excavate in Egypt is because there's an enormous power imbalance between Germany's military and Egypt's military. And so that must explain the remarkable autonomy of this dig site and the ability for the Germans to act at will right outside of the capital in Cairo. But we learned in episode 4 that it wasn't the power imbalance that changed. It was only ideas that changed. Almost every single country that obstructed Western expeditions in the 1920s and 30s did so at a time when their country was weaker overall to their previous incarnation of that state 20 or 30 years ago when they allowed Western expeditions. Think of that for a moment. Most Western expeditions were allowed into foreign countries and given assistance and help, and were allowed to remove things during a time when those host nations were stronger than they would be in the 1920s and 30s. Most of them got weaker in the intervening time, and smaller too. Many of Ottoman Empire gets shorn down to tiny little Turkey and Egypt instead of a huge empire. China was absolutely the case during the time of the Silk Road expeditions, 1900 to 1915. China's not strong compared to the Western countries, but it's infinitely stronger than it's going to be in 1930 when there isn't even a unified government and it's beset by warlords. And yet it's during that period of weakness that the Chinese successfully obstruct expeditions. Same case in the Middle East. So guns and tanks don't get you access to be able to do archaeology against the will of the host unless it's wartime. And this isn't wartime, this is 1936. Lucas is very clear, this is before World War II. Remember the case of Afghanistan, as early as 1900 and then again multiple times over the next 40 years, refuses Orlstein the right to go into his country. Okay? Hell no, you're not coming in. I know what you're going to do. You're going to map our land. So, by 1936, the year of the first film, the age of unilateral Western excavations in independent Middle Eastern countries, that means Turkey, Egypt, Iran, and Iraq, is over. Okay? It is over by 1936, absolutely, in any independent country, and Egypt is in that category. And that's where Indiana Jones, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, takes place. Our lesson from our last episode. Any newly established country, whether by dismemberment after World War I or by revolution, needs a new identity that is opposed to the previous regime. And art and antiquities fit the bill. So if the independent countries of the Middle East aren't going to let any European, British, French, or German into their country to do an archaeological dig like we see in the first film, or the third film, what does this leave for us? It leaves what are known as the mandate countries. What are the mandate countries? After World War I is over, the Ottoman Empire is dismembered, there are certain states, newly created states, that are not given independence like Egypt was, or Turkey was. Places like Palestine and Syria were said to be mandates. You're not quite ready for independence, it was said. You need to have a period of tutelage in which the most advanced civilization on earth, the most advanced empires, the French and British, who not coincidentally also won the war. It's not the losers of World War I from Europe who get to make this decision. The winners of World War I, the best empires in the world, the British and French, they will get a mandate over these places, and they will usher you in. They'll foster your independent nationhood, your mature, responsible democratic institutions, and then they'll give you independence at a date in the distant future. All right, clearly this is just another discourse for colonialism under a new guise, during an age in which everyone's supposed to be able to have self-rule. That's the new ideal. They're saying, okay, we're going to let you have self-rule one day, but you're not quite ready yet. You're still only 5 years old. You're not an adult. We'll help you get there. And they perpetuate colonialism for another 20 years. All right, so those mandate countries, Palestine for the British and Syria for the French, they actually are still amenable to archaeological expeditions because the foreigners control everything. And so the French would continue to do excavations in Syria, and the British would continue to do excavations in Palestine. Unfortunately for the film, the French and British aren't going to let the Germans in to their mandates. They're hostile to the Germans. And there's no way. So you can't just move the action to British Palestine or French Syria. That won't work because the Germans aren't in charge. Unfortunately for the filmmakers, and unfortunately for the Nazis, interwar Germany between World War I and World War II, had itself been dismembered. It was once an empire with overseas territories. But it lost all of its colonies after the war. It too, like the Ottoman Empire, was dismembered. And so, of course, they don't get any mandates after the war either. Now, if Lucas was aware of this historical problem, and I don't think he was, he could have solved it easily by simply changing the villain from the Germans to someone with an empire. He could have chosen the French, the Russians, the Japanese, even the Chinese. They all had empires. Okay? And they could have dug, agents of those empires could have dug in their own peripheral colonies. And then the action could have taken place there. Okay? Even though the villain in Indiana Jones 1 is Rene Belloc, a Frenchman, he works for the Nazis. So the chief villain is still the Nazis. Okay? French, Russian, Japanese, Chinese, anyone who had an empire still would have been perfect. But the filmmakers, Lucas chiefly it seems, was wedded to 1930s prior to World War II and the Nazis as villains for reasons entirely unrelated to history. They did consider many other villains, actually. It's not like they zeroed in on the Nazis right away. They did actually, bandy out the idea of various other villains. Lucas considered an East Asian villain. He says, quote, East Asian villains can be sinister because you can never tell what they're thinking, and they have that crazy Oriental mind. How do we know how it works? They always wait until the last minute or something. Oh yeah, I need some mouthwash. Ugh. Spielberg shoots this idea down. Quote, I think he should be German because there's something non-violent about the Oriental villain. Certainly he can be good with swords and everything, but there's something a little more ominous about a real German. More mouthwash here, please, quickly. All right, now, I'm in the history department of my university, and I can tell you, in the literature department, there are many scholars who would see this sort of language, and they would tear Lucas and Spielberg a new one. Doesn't matter how young and immature you might have been when you made these comments and how private they were. Watch out if you walk into the literary criticism department. These are code words for masculinity and femininity. A real German, all right, with guns and modern industrial technology. Whereas the Chinese are going to be, they're good with swords, kung fu and that kind of thing, Bruce Lee. But they're not real villains, right? They're feminine villains. This is a discourse that goes back to the age of Western empires, okay? And you see it unconsciously regurgitated here. Now, these ideas about an East Asian villain do actually end up in the second film, Temple of Doom. There's a 10-minute interlude, the opening scene actually, in which Lao Che, who is the chief East Asian villain, they meet in Shanghai and they have a whole bunch of, shoot-'em-up kind of adventures going through Shanghai. It's actually Hong Kong, until Indiana Jones escapes, but that's it. All right. Originally in the Brainstorm, though, it seemed as though it was possible that one of the films could have had its backdrop entirely in China, but not in the end. They also considered an Italian villain, until Lucas said, no, Italians are too crazy. That's a direct quote, by the way. I'm not paraphrasing that. That's a direct quote from the Brainstorm. No, Italians are too crazy. As we'll see, Lucas was too quick to dismiss the Italians because the Italians could have solved his history problem easily. The most easy of any other problem he has. The Italians could have solved it. How? Stay tuned in a moment. So, it must be the Germans in an era in which Germany has no empire. Okay? But the British and French ensure that if the Germans try to go into their colonial holdings, they'll be chased away. And even in neutral countries that might not be under British and French influence, the French and British would still be able to give some political incentives to local rulers to say, don't welcome the Germans and we'll sweeten up the trade deal. So the Germans would have had a really hard time finding anywhere in the Middle East where they could have done a dig at all, much less the huge scale that you see in the first and third films. So, for the sake of argument then, if the Nazis can't get into independent, non-Western countries in the Bible lands, like Egypt, and the British and French won't let them into their mandates, Syria and Palestine, where can they go? All right, we got 3 candidates here, and I'll give you the best candidate first. Libya! Libya, directly to the west of Egypt, shares its eastern border with Egypt. Okay? Libya had been an Italian colony since 1912. It had Greco-Roman ruins and evidence of Judeo-Christian connections all along the coast. That would have been perfect! And it's right there. It's just a little bit over to the west of Egypt. And the Germans were friendly with the Italians. Perfect! Problem solved. Libya. Maybe it doesn't conjure up as much romance as Egypt, but pretty much you can get everything you wanted in Egypt, you can get it in Libya as well, and it makes perfect historical sense. and the Italians would host them. Second candidate. This requires you having to tweak a few things. The first one, you don't have to tweak anything. You just have to move it west over to Libya. The second candidate, you have to tweak the time frame a little bit. All right? You have to move up to World War II when the Germans actually start conquering new territory. But if you're willing to do this, if you're willing to move it to like 1940, 1941, then Vichy France. Vichy France is the name of the wartime puppet regime in France after they succumbed to German conquests. And they're basically under the thumb of the Germans, but they're still calling themselves France. They have the pretense of being independent, referred to it as Vichy France. Well, France had North African colonies all the way to the west of Libya. Morocco, Tunisia, all those places. Algeria. All right. So once the Nazis conquer France, they also could have gotten into France's colonies in North Africa. Again, similar Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman history. You could have found plenty of things there if you wanted to. Now, this new time frame, if you wait till the outbreak of World War II, then you also get additional German and Italian conquests in the Balkans, in Greece, in Ethiopia, to the southeast of Egypt in Africa, and even parts of Egypt. For several months, the Nazis actually will conquer a significant chunk of Western Egypt. Well, that easily could have been the setting of the films that have Nazis, when the Nazis actually conquered parts of Egypt. The action could have taken place there, and it would have made sense. And the third candidate, you could just dispense entirely with the fiction and making things up and trying to go with history, and you can just say, hey, what about an actual thing that really did happen? Heinrich Himmler and his expeditions. You don't want to do his expeditions to Sweden and Finland because you don't get your Oriental exoticism there. It's just a bunch of white people. But he had an expedition to Tibet. Himmler's expedition to Tibet, 1938 to 1939. Perfect! Boy, I want to see that movie. I want to see a movie, Indiana Jones, and Himmler's expedition to Tibet under the command of Ernst Schaefer. Did Spielberg know about Himmler's expeditions and the scholarly outfit that he created to sponsor them? It's not clear from the Brainstorm, and I'm not Spielberg's friend, so I haven't had an occasion to ask him this over coffee. But from the Brainstorm, it's not clear. It's a wishy-washy area. He suggests at one point that, quote, a real slimy German character would have the name of Himmler or something like that. Himmler. He actually says Himmler. Is he aware that Heinrich Himmler was the head of this scholarly organization who did this? Or is Himmler just some vague Nazi name that he's heard about some monster Nazi, and so he associates that with a potential German villain? It's hard to say. This is pre-Schindler's List. If you know anything about Spielberg's career, I think even he himself admits that prior to doing Schindler's List, he was, not all that well informed about his own Jewish heritage, and, that's the kind of things you're supposed to know if that's a part of your identity. And doing Schindler's List was sort of a way for him to get in touch with these sort of things. So I'm not inclined in 1978 to give him the benefit of the doubt that he actually knows his Nazis and whatnot. And so it's not clear to me if he actually knows about the expeditions to Tibet that Himmler oversaw. But that is a perfect cinematic backdrop that is historically accurate. Now, beyond the Nazis in the first and third films, Peru is the next most common backdrop. Both the first film, the opening scene, the famous one recovering the golden idol and outrunning the oversized boulder, and then again in the fourth film, they go back again to Peru for much of the action, and then they're in the jungles of some undefined South American, country after they leave Peru. In the fourth film, they actually even specifically identify that he's in Cuzco, the old Incan capital, and the place where Hiram Bingham set out on his expeditions to find Machu Picchu. Okay? Unfortunately, Peru has the exact same issue as Egypt, which is the backdrop for the action in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Peru is independent. It's not a colony. It's independent, and they've had their own revolutions against Spain. So they're already in that new identity mode, where they need a new identity for their new nation based upon the material remains of their own past. They're already in nationalistic, independent mode. You can't do a free-for-all excavation there. It's not going to happen. In fact, we know that it couldn't happen there. Hiram Bingham, the so-called discoverer of Machu Picchu, we more accurately say he's the popularizer of romanticized, aesthetically pleasing images of Machu Picchu. Let's be very clear on that. In my book, I go into that in much greater detail. We're not going to sidetrack too much here on that, though. Hiram Bingham goes there in 1911 and 1912. And when he leaves, he takes with him some artifacts from Machu Picchu. Skeletons and tools and implements that he finds. He's associated with Yale University by this point. And it's actually, he was obstructed on this expedition, only no one really knew it at the time. As he left Peru, he was forced to sign a new agreement that said, you can take these things back to Yale for now, but at some point in the future, if the government of Peru ever asks you for these artifacts back and these skeletons back, you must return them. Because they belong here, and we own them. Okay? That was the agreement. And bingham, again, it's not about guns or your military power. If the natives say no, the answer is no. If they don't budge and there's no compensation that they'll accept. He signs the agreement. He's a little surprised. And he signs it. He has no other choice. Goes back to Yale. And he says, here's all of your wonderful artifacts and skeletons from the ancient Incan kingdom in Machu Picchu. Oh, by the way, I had to sign this agreement in which I promised to give everything back if they ever ask for it. And, they say, oh, don't worry, they're never going to ask for it. That's just bluster. Well, they don't ask for it for a long time. But about 90 years later, they do. This all happened in the first decade of, I think it was the late 90s and early 2000s. Peru finally said, we want it back. And Yale, dismayed, tried to sort of drag their feet for a few years, but eventually the language was clear. There was no way of getting out of it. Hiram Bingham, who worked for Yale, signed an agreement. It's as clear as day. You got to return these things. And Yale eventually complied, and they were returned and put in a museum in Cuzco. So Peru really, none of the action in Peru really works out either. 1936, forget about it. None of the stuff that happens in those films is going to be able to happen in 1936 in Peru. Or anywhere in Latin America. And you got to go back, in most cases, you got to go back to the 19th century before you're going to be able to do any of the things that occur in the movies in any real historical backdrop. All right, now the last major backdrop is India. Temple of Doom, the second film. The setting is said to be 1935, sort of a prequel to the first film. Now the film gets the geopolitics of this film more or less right. All right, the British are in control in India. They have what's known as the Raj. That's their colonial government, and we do see, there's British officials there. There is this cult, underground dark cult called the Thuggee cult that actually existed. It was in the 19th century, and they didn't tear hearts out of people's bodies and do all the horrible things that they do in the film, but it was sort of like this, dangerous secret society or brotherhood that would rob people on the street and commit murders and that sort of thing. Some thugs. That's actually where our English word thug comes from the Thuggee cult in India. Now, it was long gone by 1935. This was a 19th century thing, but it did exist. Let's give them a little bit of cinematic license here. Unfortunately, even though the second film actually gets its geopolitics right, and there's no issue of removing artifacts outside of the country, so they don't have to deal with that possibility at all. Nonetheless, the second film is unfortunately probably marred by the most extensive Orientalist stereotypes. There is pejorative Orientalism in all films, but the second one contains probably by far the most. You have that gross-out banquet, which I'm sure they thought was great fun at the time. But this is what Indians eat, right? I think in the Indian American community, I'm not going to speak as a member or anything like that because I'm far from it. But as far as I can tell, reading some things that other people have written, it seems that gross out banquet of, monkey brain stew, fried beetles, snakes, and all these horrible things that they eat, eyeballs and whatnot, eyeball soup. That's right up there with Apu from The Simpsons as sort of disseminating this unenviable image of Indians, where if you're not in the Indian American community, the only thing you probably know about Indians, if you have any impression at all, is Indiana Jones' Temple of Doom and the Gross Out Banquet, or Apu at the Quickie Mart in The Simpsons. All right up there, those two together. And this is the film that has the senseless brutality in which the natives are ripping out hearts, sending people down to their doom in a lava pit of fire. The magical artifact, every single film is a magical artifact. This is the only film where the artifact seems to have no redeemable qualities whatsoever. It's only used for evil purposes. All right, there's nothing really that anyone respects about it in that sense. In sum, all the films contain fairly demeaning stereotypes of native peoples that, let's be honest with ourselves, they're really cringeworthy today. They were also, many of them were cringeworthy even in 1978, let's face it. Okay? In the Brainstorm, they talk about, in the first film, how they want to have a monkey who's going to play an important role, and they talk about how they're going to dress him up so he looks like a little Arab. And then Spielberg chimes in, can we put a turban on him? I want to put a turban on him. Can he wear a backpack? And again, that's the kind of thing where I would never mention it if it was in the brainstorm only and didn't show up in the film. But oh god, it does show up in the film. They do have a little monkey who's dressed up like a little Arab. And it is played for laughs. Okay? At one point they talk about how the laborers, the servants who will work for Indiana Jones, the Mexicans and the Mayans, they refer to them as the third world local sleazos with the mustaches, the thin mustaches. You know, in the first film, the servants aren't exactly treated as if they're real important characters or whatnot. They're bit players, they're props who get killed left and right to further the action of the white hero, Indiana Jones. And oftentimes they are seen as sleazos. The guy in the very first scene, Satipo, is absolutely a sleazo who betrays Indiana Jones. They talk about their idea for an Arab sidekick, a little boy, who Spielberg says just talks fast and keeps on talking, and when he's talking so fast, you don't care about anything he says until suddenly he stops and says something stupid, and then everyone laughs. And again, you're thinking, oh, thank God there's no Arab little kid who does that in any of the films, and then you realize, uh-oh, Temple of Doom, Short Round, the Asian kid. That's where the idea came from. It was originally an Arab kid. You don't care about anything he says until he stops and says something stupid. Oh God, that is exactly actually what Short Round does. And there's also discussion of the character that eventually becomes Salah, Indiana Jones's good Arab friend in Cairo. He's referred to as Sabu in the Brainstorm. And Spielberg and Lucas talk about how this is going to be a character who just shows up whenever we need him. We don't have to follow his story, Lucas says. He just pops up whenever we need him. And Indiana Jones says, hey, Sabu, what are you doing here? And then Spielberg responds, yeah, I like it when a character just appears without any explanation. Well, that's fine. But that's only a literary device, a narrative device that's given to marginal bit native characters. Okay, when everyone else, their presence has to make sense when they show up. It's Sabu, aka Salah, who we'll just bring him in wherever we want him. We don't have to follow his story. Okay, that's the very definition of a prop character, like the natives were always assumed to be in Western archaeological expeditions. My favorite quote from Howard Carter talking about his time at the tomb of Tutankhamun. He has this one passage where he says, I was alone, save for my native workmen. That's a contradictory phrase. I was alone, save for my native workmen. You can't be alone if you're with your native workmen. But they're not someone's. They're nobody's. So you're still alone because you're not with any other someone who matters. That's like Salah and Sabu. It doesn't matter. You don't have to follow his story. It doesn't have to make logical sense. Whereas for Indiana Jones, Marion Ravenwood, it has to make sense or the show can't go on. Now let's move on to some surprising historical convergences. Things that it got right. Now there's some things that I think they got right intentionally, and there's some things that they got right and I think it was pure accident. Let's talk about some of the unintentional convergences based on serendipity. First, there's an American in the lead role, Indiana Jones. He's American. Oh, that's historically accurate, actually. I don't think the filmmakers knew that or intended that to be the case. But as we saw, after World War I, the Americans took over most archaeological expeditions with their money and initiative. James Henry Breasted, the Egyptologist. Okay, so Americans being the lead role is absolutely historically accurate, but I think they're just doing it because this is Hollywood, and of course the lead role is going to be American. I think that's an unintentional convergence. However, Indiana Jones is said to graduate from the University of Chicago, get his PhD from there. That, they might have done some research because James Henry Breasted, his Oriental Institute, he worked at the University of Chicago. So that actually makes sense. Indiana Jones himself, the name was selected because Lucas said that it was very Americana Square. It was supposed to be the very embodiment of hometown rural America. All right, so the American identity definitely there. The French rival of René Belloc in the first film, even though, probably one of the best villains of all the films. He is French, of course, but he works for the Nazis, so he's in their camp. Now, however, the fact that he is French is historically felicitous. That's a perfect analog to the French-run antiquity services in Egypt and Iran and other Middle Eastern states. Whenever a Middle Eastern state wanted to set up their own antiquity service to manage their antiquities business, they hired a Frenchman usually, because the British already had political and military influence, so they gave cultural influence to the French. And so it was very common for Frenchmen to be running cultural institutes like this throughout the Middle East during this time period. In fact, as we saw in the last episode, James Henry Breasted even suspected French treachery from Pierre Lecoq, the director of the Antiquities Service, during the debacle with King Tut and Howard Carter in 1923 to 1924, and said the Egyptians aren't capable of obstructing a white man like this. It must have been Pierre Lecoq. It's French perfidy trying to undermine the British. That's what really did it. Okay? So that's a wonderful historical convergence that I don't think the filmmakers were aware of in the slightest bit. At least they give no evidence of having been aware of that. All right. Plus, they also discussed multiple possible villains, and they ended up choosing the one they chose on, the basis that a German was a real villain. A real German was a real masculine villain. So the choice of villain and his nationality was just a total coincidence with history. They show a close relationship between archaeologists and intelligence agencies. This is actually, again, historically accurate. And the filmmakers, I might give them the benefit of the doubt on this one. They might have known something about this, or at least guessed at it. As we know, that was actually the case. Archaeologists were quite willing. Prior to World War I, they had this sort of informal intimacy with their department of, war departments and army departments back home. And then after World War I, it was formal cooperation. They actually worked as spies. Enthusiastically, very willingly they worked as spies. We talked about this in episode 1. So prior to World War I, they commonly shared their maps and intel that they collected in the course of their expeditions, and then went back and gave it to the Army Department. They had no problem with that. And then they also worked as spies during World War I, until eventually you get the creation of the CIA during World War II, and actual in-house intelligence agencies that sort of end the days of freelance work for archaeologists who are already now having their moral doubts about whether or not scientists should prostitute themselves. Remember the Franz Boas critique. And in the first film, Indiana Jones is approached by Army intelligence. They have information that Hitler is going after the Ark because he's a fanatic for the occult. Oh, God. Regardless, and they want to know more about the Ark. So who do they go to? They go to an archaeologist who's willing to fill them in. And they admit, we know nothing about this. And Jones tells them all about it. Okay. And then in the fourth film, it's revealed, this one takes place in 1950s, that Jones reveals he had worked as an undercover spy for the CIA, and he says that he was in Berlin and whatnot in certain years. Now, that might be somewhat of a late date for an archaeologist to be working as a spy. That was mostly over by World War II, but nonetheless, I'm not going to be a stickler for that. Archaeologists had an intimate relationship with intelligence agencies. Lucas, at one point in the Brainstorm, says that, quote, bureaucracy is the big winner in all of this. And we all know the famous scene that closes Indiana Jones 1, Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Ark is put in a crate, and it's wheeled into an enormous warehouse with a million other crates, and then it's put somewhere and lost. And the implication is that no one will ever find this thing again. And as Lucas says in the Brainstorm session, bureaucracy is the big winner. And Indiana Jones, in the scene right before this, is talking to the men from Army Intelligence, and he's saying, where is it? It's valuable. I need to study it. And they say, we have top men working on it. Who? Top men. And then they wheel it away, and it's never seen again. Bureaucracy is the big winner. Now, there was a long legacy of government indifference towards archaeologists and the stuff they brought back, unless strategic intelligence could be recovered. This point is related to our previous point about the close relationship between archaeologists and intelligence agencies. Okay. Lord Elgin, when he brought back the Elgin marbles, was dismayed to find how indifferent the British government was initially. So many things that now we think, oh wow, the most famous thing on earth is so valuable. They must have been so thrilled when they first got it. You find out, no, they weren't. The British government was highly indifferent to the Elgin marbles and consistently offered, basement bargain prices as compensation for the marbles to go into the British Museum, and Elgin held on to them significantly longer than he wanted to, accruing interest at his storage site and taking out loans because they wouldn't buy it from him so he could recoup his losses. Elgin became a financially ruined man as a result of the Elgin marbles. Okay, the government was indifferent to them. Bureaucracy was the big winner, not Elgin, not the explorer. Priam's treasure, we talked about that. Heinrich Schliemann in episode 4, the very first confrontation between a Western archaeologist and a non-Western government. Priam's treasure, we didn't really follow the story all the way to the end. It was donated to the Greek nation. Ottomans filed lawsuit. Schliemann took it out before it could be confiscated and then donated it to the Berlin Museum of Fine Arts. In 1945, the Soviet Red Army invaded Berlin, as did the United States and the Allied armies. And the Soviet armies got to that part of Berlin, and they took Priam's treasure, unbeknownst to anyone else. And for the next 40 years, 50 years, no one had a clue what happened to Priam's treasure. Even the Soviets didn't seem to know where it was. And then at some point randomly in the 1990s, it was discovered in a drawer in a basement in a museum. I think it was either St. Petersburg or Moscow, I forget which one. And then suddenly they say, hey, we had Priam's treasure. And the Russians very magnanimously and enlightenedly said, we're not giving this back to anyone. It belongs to us. This is compensations for the painful suffering we endured during World War II as well. This belongs to us. Gotta love it, right? They don't even try to make it sound good. They just say what they feel. And so now it's in Moscow now. I think it's in the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts. Okay, but again, bureaucracy was the big winner for 50 years. It was even forgotten that they had it, stuffed in a drawer in a basement and forgotten about. Oral Stein, when he brought all this stuff back from the Silk Road on 4 different expeditions, he brought back hundreds of carts and crates of things, unimaginable amount of stuff. And he was always dismayed to get back to the British Museum in London and realize that a lot of it was, in danger of growing mold, sitting down there in the British basement and not being put on display. And that was actually a consistent criticism. You said this is in the name of science, and everyone would have access to it, and now it's very difficult actually to get access to it because it's sitting in the basement of the British Museum. Bureaucracy is the big winner. Lucas, you got that one right. I don't know if you meant to, but you did. Now, we have the moral discourse of the museum. That belongs in a museum. So do you. I think this is unintentional. I mean, we've already, I don't have to explain this, right? We know that this was one of the most important discourses of the age of Western expeditions. You had to have a museum, and that justified, naturalized everything you were doing, okay? We don't have to go into that. But Lucas began the brainstorm talking about his idea for an outlaw archaeologist who was also a bounty hunter, okay? The idea about that belongs in a museum, he was not thinking of Jones, Dr. Jones, in a very positive light in the beginning. In fact, he was seen to be a very unsavory character for a very long time. And it was fascinating. One of the things, go online and type in Indiana Jones Brainstorm. You can read it yourself, and I talk about it in my book. It's fascinating to see the evolution of Lucas over these 5 days in the Brainstorm, in which he wants a roguish, unsavory character who breaks the rules and steals things and whatnot, and then gradually he realizes it's not going to be believable if Indiana Jones is not associated with a museum and a university. But if he's associated with a museum and a university, then he has to subscribe to their discourse about preservation and doing things the right way. And then his hands are trapped and he realizes, yikes, if he wants to be the good guy, he has to do all these good things and play by the rules. And then the villains are going to be the ones who don't play by the rules. And so Lucas discovers, totally unconsciously, I think, you can see the gears turning in his head during the brainstorm, in which he's suddenly realizing Indiana Jones has to conform to the Enlightenment discourse of science, preservation, and education and be associated with museums and universities in order for him to be legitimate. At one point they say he's going to be a role model for kids. We have to be careful here. He has to be the good guy. And therefore that belongs in a museum. But you can tell that Lucas comes to this not in the beginning, but relatively late, because that line, that belongs in a museum, does not occur until the third film. It doesn't appear anywhere in the first film, because they're still working out the ratio of Indy's morality in that first film. Then there's some other intentional convergences, which clearly were based on deliberate research. In the third film, at one point, they're in the Republic of Hatay, and they put the Republic of Hatay on the screen. They actually have the words there. And it's 1938 to 1939. And this is a place where the Nazis go to in order to try and ask the local sultan or the local pasha if he will outfit their expedition with camels and tanks and trucks and whatnot, whatever they need to get to the site where they think the Holy Grail is. And I remember at the time I saw this, I thought, the Republic of Hatay, that has to be absolutely made up. There's no way this funny-sounding country ever existed. I've never heard of it before. Go online, type in Republic of Hatay. It existed for like 8 months in 1938 to 1939. It was heavily under Turkish and French influence, so clearly the Nazis historically would never have been able to actually go there and get support from the local leaders. But nonetheless, I was shocked to learn that the Republic of Hatay actually existed during the time when it was supposed to have existed. Someone did their research for that one little tidbit of information. That was impressive. I'll give credit where credit is due. Now, the Republic was intentional, but the actual dynamic of the relationship between the Arab host and the Nazis and the relationship that they have there, I think that's unintentional. I actually, at one point when I taught my Indiana Jones and history course, I had my students watch that little scene. It's like a 2-minute scene. And I said, what major theme from the history of Western archaeological expeditions does this scene illustrate? And the scene is the Nazis asking for the local leader to facilitate their expedition, essentially. Give them supplies and all this sort of stuff. And in exchange, they offer him a chest full of gold, trinkets, and jewelry and whatnot. And he turns around and he points to the Rolls Royce that they drove in on. And he starts talking about Western technology and how beautiful this is and the power of the engine. That's an emblem of Western industrialism and modernity and science. And he says he wants that. And then they say, the keys are in the ignition, Your Highness. And they give it to him. That is the compensations of plunder. That's perfect. And I test my students on that. And there are exact analogs to that in history. At one point, Sven Hedin, with a Sino-Swedish expedition, gets to Xinjiang and meets the governor of Xinjiang, and the governor of Xinjiang asks him, when he goes back to Sweden, can he arrange for the purchase of 10 Ford motor cars? And of course, Hedin knows that this guy can ruin his expedition if he wants to. He says, of course, I'll help you buy the cars. That's almost an exact analog to what goes on in the film. But there's no way the filmmakers were aware of that. I guarantee that. They got the Republic of Hatay right. They did not get the compensations of plunder intentionally right in that scene. One other issue we have to deal with. Okay, one other issue before we get to our final point where I unveil the best plot ever for the 5th Indiana Jones that no one's going to listen to. Gender and women. Okay, gender and women. You don't get much of an opportunity, as I said in the very first film, to talk about gender and women in the history of archaeological expedition. You know, this is a theme, a historical topic that is really dude-centric, okay? Nonetheless, each film has a major female lead who tends to be just as tough as Indy, at least in 3 out of 4 cases. In the second film, Temple of Doom, Kate Capshaw as Willie is sort of the exception to this, and, you know, her character is the one who acts like this little, you know, ballerina girl who is looking after her hair, and she's scared of everything and screaming all the time, and, you know, that sort of thing. The exact opposite. And, you know, in the third film, they went back to a more tough, respectable female villain. This is great for cinema. It's great for cinema to be able to have a strong female lead opposite the male hero. But is there any analog in history? Surprisingly, yeah, a little. There is, usually in the role of dutiful wife, a wife who follows her archaeological husband into the field. All right, now, there were many archaeologists who were lifelong bachelors. Sven Hedin, Orlstein, never married, no evidence of any sort of relationship at all with the other sex. One biographer of Orlstein has even gone so far to wonder if maybe he was homosexual because it was so strange that he never married. Was he truly married to his career? And they wanted to answer that question. But other archaeologists had regular domestic lives, and they brought their wives with them. Leonard Woolley in Iraq, Flinders Petrie, an Egyptologist in Egypt, they worked alongside their wives. And their wives got involved in the expeditions, in leadership roles, you know, managing the workforce. They left their own accounts, they wrote their own things. Agatha Christie was another very famous one, who for 10-20 years also was involved in archaeology with her husband. All right, someone needs to do some more research on these women. Maybe it's been done, but I haven't seen it. That would be a wonderful area for someone to do research. The women that we see in the archaeological expeditions. Now, the best cinematic analog is Giovanni Belzoni's wife, Sarah. Giovanni Belzoni, cast your mind back. That's 1816, fairly early in our storyline. All right, he's the Italian hydraulic expert who ends up going into the circus and doing hydraulics in the circus in England on the stage to make a living. Meets Sarah, an English rope dancer. They get married. And then when he goes to Egypt to try and sell a water device to Muhammad Ali to help improve agriculture, that's that engineering irrigation advice, one of the forms of political capital, right? He then finds out that the Sultan, that the Pasha doesn't want his water device, so then he goes and starts getting, transporting the Memnon head and other things back to the British Museum, and that's his new career. He brings Sarah Belzoni with him on all of his travels. She's there, and she leaves her own account as well. In general, Giovanni Belzoni, I don't know how Hollywood has not discovered this guy yet. It is a ready-made story for Hollywood, and the benefit of doing Giovanni Belzoni is that he's operating in a time and place where you could do all the stuff that they want to do in the Indiana Jones films. That was all okay then. And he's even got a kick-ass tough wife who goes along with him, a rope dancer to boot. Hollywood, look into Giovanni Belzoni. Now, the film seems somewhat progressive overall, except for the second film, in their casting of strong female leads. But once again, the brainstorming session seems to sully a little bit what we might assume is a progressive aspect of the film. Here is the discussion on Marion Ravenwood's character from the brainstorm. And again, I'm only doing this because a trace of this discussion ends up in the final script. Lucas, I was thinking that this old guy could have been his mentor, Indiana Jones's mentor, his old advisor in grad school. He could have known this little girl when she was just a kid, had an affair with her when she was 11. Kasdan, and he was 42. Lucas, he hasn't seen her in 12 years. Now she's 22. It's a real strange relationship. Spielberg, she had better be older than 22. You can see him doing the math in his head of how old she's going to be, and the audience is going to figure it out. Lucas, all right, he's 35, and he knew her 10 years ago when he was 25 and she was only 12. Oh, good. Good for Lucas. He's increased her age from 11, having an affair, to 12. Kasdan, it would be amusing to make her slightly young at the time. And promiscuous. She came on to him. 12 years old! Are you serious? Lucas, 15 is right on the edge. I know it's an outrageous idea, but it is interesting. Once she's 16 or 17, it's not interesting anymore. But if she was 15 and he was only 25, and they actually had an affair the last time they met, and she was madly in love with him, and he, ... Spielberg, she has pictures of him. Oh my God, you've got to be kidding me. Pictures of an affair, 11 years old, 25, 42? Oh, where's that mouthwash? Yuck. Now this creepy discussion actually leaves a legacy in the first film. Most viewers don't notice it because it's quick and you haven't read this brainstorm, so you don't realize where it comes from. But at the bar scene in Nepal, when Indy first shows up and meets Marion again after the passage of this 10 years or whatever it is, Marion says to Indy right after she punches him, he says, "What was that for?" And they allude to a relationship in the past. And she seems a little older, her age, she doesn't seem so young, so you think maybe this is only a few years ago. But no, her line is, "I was just a child then." And what is Indy's response? He says gruffly, "You knew what you were doing." Yuck! Yuck! 11 years old! I was just a child. They even say the word child. Now, maybe you were like me when you saw this and you thought, oh, he's just using child loosely. It doesn't really mean she was a child. And then you see the brainstorm and you realize it's 11 or 12 years old. Shame on you guys. Come on. All right. If I was Steven Spielberg, okay, there is a fifth film, as you all know, coming out in 2020. All right, I think they're going to start filming next year, 1919. So it's probably too late. Plus, I know they don't like to hear unsolicited ideas from wacko professors anyways. But nonetheless, I need to get this off my chest. Times have changed, Mr. Spielberg. I respectfully submit, in light of the previous 4 episodes, and this 5th episode as well, that if you want your movie to age more gracefully than the first 4 movies have aged, you need to radically overhaul the plot. You need someone who actually knows something about the history of archaeological expeditions. This is the age of Apu as an insult. This is the age of Me Too. You cannot do casual Orientalist racism and sexism and exoticism and stuff that you've done in the previous films. It was fun and partially excusable back when it was 40 years ago. It's not going to be okay in 2020. All right. Now, I'm not a stickler for political correctness, but I am for historical correctness. And I do believe that in this case, historical accuracy can mean better storytelling. It can mesh with our identity politics, not in a forced, affirmative action, stilted type of way, but it can actually be, this is how it was really historically, and it's fun, and it makes everyone feel good because we know this is what it was actually like, and no one feels insulted at the end, when we're not having fun at someone else's expense. Kaufman says that this is supposed to be fun. I agree. No one wants to watch something that's historically accurate but not fun. Well, here's my answer. This is going to be fun. It's going to be good for business, good for politics, and it's going to be good for entertainment. The next film, Terracotta Warriors. That's what it's going to be. It's got to be the Terracotta Warriors. That is the best candidate for the artifact that's going to be fought over, with a Chinese co-archaeologist in a starring role. Okay? The timeline and the geopolitical backdrop is perfect. With Harrison Ford in the role, we know they're committed to Harrison Ford. So if you're going to extrapolate his age from the previous films, it means that the time frame has to be like late 1960s to early 1970s. Okay? And that has to be the time frame because the fourth film was in the mid 1950s. And we're already 12 years away from that. Indiana Jones is going to be in his mid 70s. That's okay. Orlstein was 68 when he did his fourth expedition in 1930. That's not an impediment. It shouldn't be, no one should be looking at Harrison Ford and being like, is he too old? No. That's okay. All right, it's admirable. So we're in the 1970s as far as backdrop. Okay? And the Terracotta Warriors are perfect. They fit into this timeline perfectly. In 1971, Henry Kissinger has his secret meetings with Zhou Enlai. Remember, there's non-recognition between the PRC, People's Republic of China, and the United States for over 20 years. Kissinger meets secretly with Zhou Enlai. They arrange the 1972 visit of Richard Nixon to meet Mao Zedong and have his China visit. And then they promise to recognize the PRC, and the PRC will take the China seat at the United Nations. 2 years later, the Terracotta Warriors are discovered. 1974 is the year of the Terracotta Warriors. Okay? If you can find a plot that deals with the Terracotta Warriors in China, with a Chinese co-archaeologist, that makes historical sense. The Chinese have had their own indigenously trained, competent archaeologists for 50 years by this point. Okay? You will solve the problem of the King Tut or the Hedin effect, i.e. that you can't do Indiana Jones-style free-for-all archaeology after World War I in a non-colonial context. Good luck, guys. If the action takes place in 1970, I don't know where the hell you're going to go to find a place where any independent state, and they're all independent now pretty much, is going to let you do anything remotely approaching what Indiana Jones does in the films. Good luck with that. All right, here's how I answer that. Terracotta Warriors, I'm going to set the scene here. Terracotta Warriors are discovered by a peasant farmer in Xi'an, central China. And that's the truth, all right? 1974, it's a peasant farmer in Xi'an. Then a rogue villager sells some of the statues, or reveals the location of the statues to Soviet archaeologists through Mongolia. Mongolia is a Soviet satellite. It's just north of Xi'an. Totally plausible. Okay? But Indiana Jones, who's working as sort of a semi-retired, undercover visiting archaeologist in Moscow, learns that his rival Russian archaeologist has discovered the location of the Terracotta Warriors soon after they've been discovered. Okay? And he then travels across the Soviet Union to try and track down the illicitly sold statues through Central Asia. He's trying to track down the Russian guy who is stealing the Terracotta Warriors. Okay? And they have all these hijinks and adventures throughout Central Asia. Great backdrop. You want your Oriental exoticism? There it is. All right? And in the meantime, he bumps into, inadvertently, a Chinese archaeologist who is also trying to track down the Russian-Soviet archaeologist who is taking away the Terracotta Warrior statues. Because they also see that as very valuable. It can't just be a white guy going after these things, okay? If you want the exoticism of being in a foreign land, you have to have a foreign co-star in this. You have to. Both for today's politically correctness and because it's historically right. That's what you should do. That reflects the facts of history. And the Chinese see the Terracotta Warriors as emblems of their nation. Right? They, like everyone else, are living in nationalism mode. Okay? It doesn't matter that the first emperor of the Qin dynasty in 221 BC, who had the army built for his afterlife army, it doesn't matter that he would have said, this is my army, it doesn't belong to China, it's not an emblem of the Chinese people, screw you, this is mine, my personal property. It doesn't matter. Today, the Chinese see it as an emblem of the Chinese nation, representative of the blood, sweat, and tears of the Chinese, and the genius and the talent of the Chinese nation, this abstract thing. So they have their own archaeologist hot on the trail of this Russian rogue archaeologist as well. And they're all trying to track down the illicitly confiscated Terracotta Warriors that are being taken out of Xi'an. All right? And Indiana Jones and the Chinese archaeologists bump into each other, see each other as hostile enemies at first, but eventually they decide to work together. All right? And then they have adventures in Central Asia and Mongolia and China, sure, trying to track the movements of the bad Russian archaeologists. This is all in parallel fashion to the Nixon visit that just happened. The United States and China are a little bit suspicious of one another, but they're committed to working together now and recognizing each other. It's a preview of the most important bilateral relationship in today's world. This is good for business. This is going to get your Chinese audience to go see the movie and not be offended by it. And then finally, the denouement of the whole film is that the Russian archaeologist who has also uncovered ancient Chinese manuscripts and texts from the terracotta warrior burial, he chants these ancient Chinese texts to bring the terracotta army to life. This is an Indiana Jones film, by the way. It has to come to life at the end. Okay? It comes to life. And he's hoping that he can command the army to help the Soviets take over the world. And no one will know that it's the Soviets doing it. If you drop a nuclear bomb, you know it's the Soviets who did that. If you bring the terracotta warrior army to life, no one knows that you did it, and they obey your commands because you have the secret Chinese manuscript that you can chant. And so that's the exciting action point, is that the terracotta army comes to life. Jackie Chan can be one of the general warriors of the terracotta warriors that comes to life. Get some star power in there. Okay? But what happens, and this is the unexpected twist that every movie needs to have, is that when the army comes to life, it turns out to be a patriotic Chinese army. We have a little bit of historical license here. I'm okay breaking some historical rules for the sake of a little bit of Hollywood fun, okay? The terracotta warriors end up being patriotic. They're not the private property of the first emperor. They're defenders of China. And they, instead of attacking the enemies of Russia, they kill the Russian army. And then they seem like they're going to go after Indiana Jones as well. And they're going to kill him also because they think he's an enemy of China. But no, Nixon has just done his visit to them. And the US and China are starting to create a new nascent friendship. And the Chinese archaeologist commands the terracotta warriors to spare Indiana Jones. And then they get the army to march back to Xi'an, back to where they were uncovered. And the Chinese build a museum themselves over the terracotta warriors like they actually did. And the movie ends with the world as it should be. And this also will explain the real reason why so many of the terracotta warriors that are believed to be still underground, unexcavated, remain unexcavated. Because the Chinese know, based on this film, that they can come to life and be a very dangerous force that's difficult to control. Okay. The Chinese audience is going to love it. They're going to stand up in their seat and clap. Patriotic terracotta warriors come to life. You can get your Western white man star power for the Western world. You can have a Chinese co-star for the Chinese world. No one feels insulted. Everyone feels great. It's historically accurate to the, before they come to life. Before they come to life, it's historically accurate. It's the perfect backdrop for a 1970s plot. I made this suggestion at one point to a talk, and a lady suggested that the Chinese archaeologist should be a woman. And I said, that's a great idea. Absolutely should be a woman. And then I realized, but Harrison Ford's going to be in the lead role. It doesn't matter that he's going to, in his 70s. That never stopped a romantic relationship before, right? That's going to be awkward. It's okay for most of the Westerners, but if there's any sort of sexual tension or romance or anything, it's not going to go over well with the Asian audiences. White man, Asian woman, no, that's not good. So yes, I agree. It would be great and progressive to have a female as the co-star, as an archaeologist. And that's historically accurate as well, but unfortunately, that's the politics of that are got to be sorted out a little more. Maybe you have to have two Chinese archaeologists and they're a couple, because you don't want any suggestion that the white man gets the Asian girl. This would make for good history, good drama, good politics, and good business. I am sensitive to that, Hollywood. You got to make money. I get it. So I say to you, Mr. Spielberg, I'm waiting for my phone to ring.